This morning, we will start with a musical offering from the Upper School Concert Choir. Then we will hear from our keynote speaker, Mr. James Mckim. We have also invited several Derryfield adults to share their reflections with you, and then there will be time for you to submit questions via the email address communications@derryfield.org, or students in 6th and 8th grade. We will provide you with nifty index cards and even niftier pencils to submit your questions. And then if there is time, we will have the pleasure of hearing a second piece from the concert choir. So, our musical offering. Let me first tell you who are going to be our Derryfield panelists. You will hear more from them in a bit. They are Mrs. Byron, Ms. Stimpson, Mr. Bongiorno, and Mr. Barnard, and the panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Gaucher. Now I'd like to introduce to you our keynote speaker. James Mckim is a managing partner of Organizational Ignition, a management consulting practice. He is a sought-after organizational performance speaker, coach, change manager, and author of the best-selling book, The Diversity Factor, Igniting Superior Organizational Performance. Over his 35-plus year career, He has helped small and large organizations, for-profit and nonprofit, spark efficiency and growth through the aligning of people, process, and technology. Mr. Mckim is known nationally for his current focus on organizational and individual performance through diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. Recognized by industry watchers such as ATD, Brandon Hall, Burson Associates, Excelos, and PMI for his dedication to creating win-win situations between organizations and their employees, he has guided organizations such as Cheshire Medical Center, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and the Massachusetts Partner for Diversity in Education through defining and executing DEI strategies. As the chair of the Episcopal Church's National Executive Council Committee on Racism and Reconciliation, Mr. Mckim was the principal writer of the church's guidelines on anti-racism and reconciliation. As president of the Manchester branch of the NAACP, he works regularly with governments and businesses to eliminate discrimination. He is a frequent conference presenter, a guest on radio and television shows, serves as the chair of the Finance Committee of the New Hampshire PBS Board of Directors, and he delights in being the vocalist for the jazz band, the Episcocats. Mr. Mckim.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and in the words of that wonderful choir, now is the time for change. I was graduated from the Porter-Gaud School, an independent day school in Charleston, South Carolina. It was founded in 1964 with the merger of Porter Military Academy and the Gaud School for Boys. When I was there, the student body totaled approximately 600 in grades 1 through 12. One of the preeminent college preparatory schools in the Southeast, and yes, I am proud to be a preppy. My class was 62 students, and we all went off to colleges around the world. Sound familiar? Very much like your school. I came north to Dartmouth. With the difference in temperature, people asked me, "What were you thinking?" Well, I was thinking, I love computers. And Dartmouth was one of the preeminent schools for computer science, with the basic computer language being invented there. That's why I went. Now here I am, still not loving the cold, but loving the community. Speaking of community, the theme for today is working towards a beloved community. What is the beloved community? Beloved community is a term that was first coined in the early days of the 20th century by the philosopher-theologian Josiah Royce, who founded the Fellowship of Reconciliation. However, it was Dr. Martin Luther King, also a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who popularized the term and invested it with a deeper meaning. For Dr. King, beloved community was a global vision, a vision of love, a vision of a place and a time where all people share the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness are not tolerated because international standards of human decency do not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice are replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. In the beloved community, International disputes are resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of by military power. On a personal level, everyone feels as if they belong. How do you feel when you belong? C.E. Garcia says that people feel like they belong when they have a role and responsibility, where there are people who look like them around them, where they feel valued and cared for, where their racial identity and culture is recognized and valued, and they share interests or values with others around them. In this speech we've been looking at and thinking about, Dr. King uses the phrase, the salvation of our civilization. This is a reference to beloved community. So how do we achieve this beloved community? What might it take here at Derryfield School, in the greater Manchester area, in New Hampshire, to become beloved community? To understand how to become beloved community, we must first understand why we are not beloved community. There are 3 levels of discrimination that make people feel as if they don't belong to a beloved community. Interpersonal level, institutional and systemic level, and structural level. At the interpersonal level, people commit, at best, microaggressions or verbal put-downs. At worst, bodily harm. At the institutional or systemic level, organizations have policies and procedures and best practices that deny equal access to jobs and opportunities. At the structural level, society has created inequities in health, education, and housing, to name a few. Why does this discrimination exist? Because we are all biased. I'm biased. Our 5 senses send billions of bits of data into where? Our amygdala, every second. How do we process all of that? Quickly. We do so by the process of generalization. That process where we find patterns in all that data that comes into our brains. And in doing so, we rely on stereotypes, which is where we often discriminate. When we see a black man walking down the street, we tense up. I tense up, and I'm a black man. And perhaps we just move to the other side of the street to avoid that person. That's a microaggression. That's discrimination. How do we overcome being discriminatory and moving toward the beloved community? Dr. King says that we achieve beloved community through love. And he goes on to describe 3 types of love. Eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love. Philia, a sort of reciprocal love you have for personal, intimate friends, people you can call on the phone and, or for you, many of you, text on your phone. You go to have dinner with them. And agape love, more than eros, more than philia, something of an understanding and creative and redemptive goodwill for all men. A love that seeks nothing in return. These types of love are actually Greek words for love. And there are only 3 of the, anybody know how many Greek words there are for love? Many? 8. The one word in English we use, love, Greek has 8 words for. Right? And we've heard 3. The others are pragma, enduring love, ludus, playful love, philautia, self-love, storge, familial love, and mania, obsessive love. But of all these types of love, Dr. King says that it is the agape form of love that can transform opposers or enemies into friends. If you love your enemies, you'll soon discover that at the very root of love is the power of redemption. In the classroom, on the ball field, at a meal, in the park, treat everyone with love. Keep loving, even if you're being mistreated. Dr. King tells a story of a person who has a neighbor, and that neighbor is doing something wrong to this person. He says, just keep being friendly to that person. Keep loving them. Don't do anything to embarrass them. Just keep loving them. And they won't be able to stand it for too long. Oh, they'll react in many ways in the beginning. They'll react with bitterness because they're mad, because you love them. They'll react with guilt feelings. And sometimes they'll hate you a little bit because you love them. And they want to do wrong to you. But you love them. Keep loving them. By that power of love, they'll break down. That's redemptive love. There's something about hate that tears people down and is destructive. There's something about love that builds up and is creative. So the message of these words from his speech, and indeed Dr. King's life and his life's work, the message is love everyone, even your enemies, with agape love. Agape love has within it that redemptive power, the power that eventually transforms individuals. Change. If you hate your enemies, you have no way to redeem and to transform them. It's this type of love that knows no bounds and can create the beloved community in which we all want to live. Thank you.
Mr. Mckim, what a wonderful address that was. Thank you so much for being here today to speak to the Derryfield community. If we could give him one more round of applause, I think that'd be really nice. So now we're welcoming to the stage Miss Byron, Mr. Bongiorno, Ms. Stimson, and Mr. Barnard. And they're going to speak a little bit about the themes of Mr. Mckim's address, about how in their individual lives they work towards this notion of building this beloved community that we all have a role in which to play. So each faculty member is going to speak for 3 or 5 minutes or so. And then at the end, as time allows, we're going to engage in a discussion and ask some questions. We encourage you to ask questions, to fill out. I believe there are note cards, correct, that they can fill out and pass up questions? Yes. So there are note cards. You'll be able to fill out questions. And I'll be looking at those, and you'll have the opportunity to ask those. So thank you very much for your attention. Ms. Byron, if you could please start us off.
Do I need this? Do I need this? No. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you. Those are wonderful words. As we pause today to think deeply and honor the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we've all been asked to share our stories and experiences of being a part of a beloved community. And before I begin to share mine, I'd just like to spend a little bit of time looking at different types of communities. Because communities are unique. They can be large, small, intimate, strange. They could be 4 people sitting around a table for dinner, laughing about the day. They can be made up of people cheering on a sports team or singing gospel music on a Sunday morning at church. A community is even an auditorium of students coming together to hear a shared message. Whatever the reason for gathering, it's vital to know that the strength of a community is not measured by its numbers, but rather by the kindness of its members. In preparing to speak today, I came across a quote from a neuroscientist and author, Abhijit Naskar, who wrote, quote, "Kindness kindles kinship, and kinship kindles a sense of community." I paused when I read that quote because I was struck by the word kinship. Because for me, it beautifully encapsulates the soul of a community and speaks to its power. Growing up, I've had the opportunity to be a part of a number of different communities. But I would just like to briefly touch upon 2 distinct communities and the kindness and kinship within them that made them invaluable spaces in my life. The first community was very small and very intimate. It was my immediate family. This included for me my younger sister, myself, and my mom. I was raised by a single mom in a house of all women. Since it was just my mom who raised us, she brought us everywhere. We ran errands with her. Wherever she went, we went. My mom was old school. She did not believe in banks. She, I hate to say this, didn't pay her taxes. And I'm pretty sure my mom didn't graduate from high school. She grew up poor, and she worked her whole life. One detail about my mom is that she carried her money in cash in a rectangular white envelope in her large purse. She used cash to pay for everything. And it was at a very young age that I became aware of the cost of things, of food, of clothes, of living. The sacrifices she made to make sure that my sister and I were taken care of, and the countless acts of kindness and love from her, created and strengthened our kinship. And they made our small community of 3 one that I am forever grateful for. The second community I grew up in was actually a daycare center. And it was owned by my mom. She owned it for 35 years. It was called Happy Day Childcare. And it was within this community, in an all-black urban setting, where many people lived either at or below the poverty line, that I spent the bulk of my childhood and formative years. Every day, my small community of 3, my mom, my sister, and me, would get up at 5 because we needed to be at the nursery at 6 to open. That's 6 a.m. This nursery was part of the fabric of a neighborhood in East Detroit, and the people in the neighborhood, the families, and the countless kids who walked through its doors became connected with one another. I became connected with them. Kids like Jimmy and Ansel and Kenneth and Corey, just to name a few. In the summer, my mom ran a day camp, and we would all pile into a van and drive to the state parks to swim, play baseball, go bowling or roller skating if it was raining. And we spent countless hours together within this shared space, developing friendships and an understanding of each other. These relationships were examples of another type of kinship. Not a kinship in the sense of family bonds, but a kinship of childhood experiences that united us despite our many cultural and racial differences. Many of the kids were from this neighborhood. They lived here. They went to school and church here. And while I did not, I did have this space, which was created by the existence of this nursery, where I began to see and understand and experience this concept of difference. Difference in skin color, difference in culture, difference in opportunity. Differences make up a community. But somehow these differences also unite it. During the shared hours we spent in this space, we became like a second family. Kindness, acceptance, and kinship were cultivated within this community. This was a beloved community. It was here where I learned and practiced empathy and gained an early understanding of not only the need for equality and equity and the kindness and acceptance of others. And as Naskar observed, the kinship that is part of any community which is necessary in order for it to become beloved. Thank you.
That was really wonderful, Ms. Byron. Thank you so much for that. Mr. Barnard, if you could please come.
Good morning. Morning. Good morning. There we go. Okay, I'm going to evoke my inner Mr. Burke here. Raise your hand if you're still listening. All right. So that's what I want to talk about this morning, and that's listening. As I think of beloved communities and belonging, one of the most powerful beloved communities I've been part of is my faith tradition, which is Quakerism, the Society of Friends. And I was raised Quaker and attended a Quaker day and then boarding school from kindergarten up through graduation of high school, and a school about the size of Derryfield in terms of classes. And those of you who aren't familiar with Quakerism, it is kind of founded, or the foundation of the religion is based on the notion that there is that of the Spirit or God, or however you define God, there is that of God in each of us. And that we all have equal access to that Spirit. So no one person has more access to God, to Spirit, to light than any other person. Right? And so based on that, we are all equal. Right? We all have equal access. There's not one individual. And our worship, our services are held in silence. And it is an expectant silence where people use that silence in different ways. But it is an opportunity to listen. And to me, being part of a beloved community, belonging, requires and asks us to listen. And that is something that's been really powerful to me in listening to people and perspectives and deep listening. Right? And listening for understanding, and listening for a deeper sense of who people are and where they're coming from. There's so much noise, so much information overload. There's so much talking. There's so many quick news cycles right now. And I think it's such an important skill. It's important for us to be part of a beloved community, to listen to each other, to listen to ourselves. And in that listening, we can be expectant for what we hope to hear, but also what others want us to hear. So listening with complete openness. I found that really powerful. Even now, in the last couple months, some of my classmates from high school and I have been holding kind of virtual Quaker meetings once a month. And we had that yesterday. We're doing it on the third Sunday of every month. And so I had classmates from Tokyo at 2 a.m., and Illinois and California and the Carolinas and Massachusetts and all over the place, of all different backgrounds. And we sit there on Zoom in silence until somebody wants to speak and share what they're thinking or what they're moved to share. And it has been really powerful to hear where people are right now and to hear where they're coming from and what they're struggling with, what they're joyful about, and what they feel moved to share as kind of their experience. And so I guess I would just say, listen. Listen to yourself, listen to those around you, and pause before you speak, and pause before you form opinions. There's a quote from a famous poet that goes something like, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it's something like, freedom is that time between what you hear and the opinion you form. And so listening in that freedom is a really important piece of this puzzle. Thank you.
I sincerely hope you were listening. Mr. Bongiorno.
Good morning.
Good morning.
For those of you who know me well, you know that I do a lot of work with musical theater. And this summer I worked on a show called Godspell. And in that show there's this great number where they sing about creating, creating a beautiful city. And in thinking about, as soon as Ms. Russell asked me to be on this panel, that sprang to my head. And in thinking about what that means, I think it means living with intention. As a community, uniting under a shared set of intentions. I think the Derryfield School does that really well. And I'm grateful to be part of this community where we set out to listen to each other, where we set out to love each other. I think we should all embrace that spirit and bring it into our other communities. It's something that will give you life and energy, passion, and a shared sense of community. I hope you all will take that message with you and live in that light and help to build that beautiful city. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Bongiorno. Dean Stimson.
Thank you so much. Well, Martin Luther King is my hero. Let's just start with that. So that's humbling to begin with, to be asked to be on this panel with people that I dearly love. And I've known James Mckim for a long time, since our kids were little together. And so it's just so interesting how the interconnectedness of community, that is wild, isn't it? Our kids grew up together, biracial kids in a town that was very, very white. And boy, I felt so welcomed by Mr. Mckim when we arrived, and I was nervous, and I brought all my fears with me and my preconceived notions about what would happen to my kids, and just a lot of fear, right? So it's just so interesting how if you send out the vibes of you are welcome here, And I found that over and over again. My fear was unrealized in Goffstown, New Hampshire. So I brought a lot with me, and that is what I wanted to just mention. So some really important themes. In belonging to a beloved community, Dr. Martin Luther King would say, if one is oppressed, we are all oppressed. Wow. That is very, remarkable to think about, because how will we know if anyone feels oppressed unless we ask, right? And who's at the table to talk about how they feel? So opening up the table so that students have a voice is something that I feel very passionate about. And this community has been amazing. Dr. Carter supporting me to be the director of student leadership. It's a huge opportunity. So that one of my goals to be realized would be that all students have a voice in our program, no matter who you are, where you come from, how you got here. You're here, you belong. That's it. So how do we reach everybody? And I think the LEAD program, it's new, it's getting started, might be a way that systemically, what Mr. Mckim talked about, we build it in our program so every student would hear, you can be a leader. You can be a leader. You can learn how to lead. You can lead in all different ways, big and small. You could just be a leader by being a friend to a new person in our community. By being a friend when someone doesn't have anyone to sit with at lunch, that you would go sit with them. Hey, what's up? How are you? How's it going? When you see someone sad in the hallway. And what I've been so struck by in the Derryfield community is how kind you are. So kind, so thoughtful. It doesn't mean you're perfect. No one has to be perfect. But striving to be inclusive is the key. And recognizing when someone feels marginalized. There are all different reasons why people feel marginalized. And so to be a community where we ask the question, do you feel like you belong? That's a really important question. And as the director of student leadership, I have a unique opportunity to work with all these student groups who can put the feelers out and say, how do people feel? What do you think about this issue? What do you think about this issue? Maya leading the school the way she does, meeting with the middle school leaders, that's tremendous. That was a goal that she put forth, and she's doing it. So she can make sure she hears from the middle school as well as the upper school. That's tremendous. So students have a really remarkable ability to see things for one another in a way that I cannot, because I'm an adult and I see things differently, and I come with a lot more bias because I've been here for years and years. So I have to, as a leader, check my own bias all the time. That's a huge part of Mr. Mckim's message. We all have it, whether we recognize it or not, but that's when it's really dangerous, when you don't. You want to be, as a leader, as self-aware as you can, because that will help catch the thoughts as they come in. Judging someone, putting someone down, even in your mind is where it starts before it comes out of your mouth. So being a student leader, being a leader at the school, to somebody who has been given much, much is expected. And so I have to hold myself accountable constantly. Careful what I think, careful what I say, careful how I judge, and just to be completely self-aware. I had grown up with a mom from Latin America, and we started out in Dorchester, so I resonate over here with the Detroit. I'm from Dorchester, Massachusetts. I was born in Quincy, Mass, and lived in Dorchester, Massachusetts until first grade, where I was a minority. I looked like a minority, being a Hispanic American, but blue eyes, blonde hair, and speaking all Spanish at home. And I had to repeat kindergarten because I didn't know English enough. My dad would arrive late home from work, and I would only have an hour or two with him to speak English. So I have a very unique perspective, but I also have seen lots of hate towards my mother, which is very, very difficult. So when we moved from Dorchester to New Hampshire, I thought, is it going to happen again? Is she going to be judged for her accent? or, looked at funny. And so I have to be careful that when I view the world, I see my mom, who was very pleasant and very kind to her oppressors, kept a lot of it inside so they wouldn't see it and bring it home and tell me all about it. And so I have to weigh that. And I have to weigh all the opportunities that I have that she never had, growing up in Honduras and then El Salvador. And much I have been given, much is expected. That's weighty. But I want to do justice for my mom and all the things that she had to go through to get me where I am today. I feel that. And when I moved from Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, which is inner city Hartford, Connecticut, as a community organizer, back to New Hampshire with my little kids and my African-American husband, I thought, oh my gosh, is it going to happen to my kids? How are they going to be treated? How will they be accepted? Will they be beloved? Will they be seen for who they really are and the gifts they are? And I brought all of those worries, I brought all of those biases with me, and I had to check myself because I said, Raina, don't project your fear on them. Make sure they're equipped, make sure they're good people, they're kind, they do the best for their community, and look out for them, of course, as a parent would. But be careful that you don't judge and worry unnecessarily either. So I will say that in New Hampshire, I won't speak for my kids because that's their story. But my story was to check myself, make sure I wasn't overly worried about them, and recognize that there were people like my neighbor who were wonderful, accepting people, and now see how it comes all back because what you put out there comes back. It will come back to you. And so as soon as I heard that he was coming, I thought, wow, what are the chances on this theme that we would be together on this stage? That's tremendous. We supported one another and in the Goffstown community, and then look at where we are today. I find that very interesting. So anyway, thank you for your time, and we have time for questions? All right, thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing with us today. I think the community really appreciates it. I'd like to ask some questions to all of you. This first question is for Mr. Mckim. If Dr. King spoke about the notion of a beloved community as the salvation of our civilization, that the end notion of progress for all of us ultimately has to come down to this. You spoke, eloquently about Dr. King's ability to find the strength to love in the face of hate, to have the courage to love in the face of cruelty. Could you speak a little bit about how our students can find the strength to love in the face of hate?
What a great question. How can students find the courage to love in the face of hate? I think Dr. King would say, you need to realize that your fate is tied up with your enemy. Your fate is tied up with that of your enemy. So it is in your best interest to love your enemy. It's not easy. It's never easy because our emotions get in the way. We are emotional creatures. Some of us like to think, and I'm wearing a Star Trek pin, which means I followed Mr. Spock and logic. We think we're logical people. We are not. Logic is in service of our emotions. So we have to come to know our emotions, be able to know what our triggers are beforehand, so that when those triggers do happen, and triggers being those things that happen to us that set us off. When I hear heavy metal, that sets me off. It's a trigger. but I know that about myself, right? So we need to understand ourselves, and you're here in school with a great opportunity to learn about yourselves as much as you're learning about the world. So once you know about yourself, then in any situation you get into, if someone does something that harms you, you can take a deep breath, and it's so important to always take a deep breath and just feel how you are listening to yourself before you speak or take an action. It's that pause, that deep breath, that gives you the courage to love.
Thank you. Could you please pass the microphone to Ms. Byron? Ms. Byron, I appreciated your comments. You spoke about a community is measured by the kindness of its members, that kinship builds a community. And you spoke some about the kinship of your childhood experiences. How do we build kinships with those who've had different experiences from ourselves that we endeavor to appreciate, to recognize that someone's experiences are different than our own, and we want to listen? But yet at the same time, we can never fully know someone else's experiences. How do we build those kinships across the different human experiences that others have had that we may not have had, yet we endeavor to know?
Another great question. I think I'm going to speak a little bit about what Mr. Brennan said in terms of the power of listening. If we can listen, we can learn, we can understand. That is where we begin to build bridges, and those bridges become that kinship, and that kinship becomes this shared space and this shared experiences that come to community. So it's almost this stepping stone process that I see. And I think another important aspect besides listening, and Mr. Mckim touched upon this, is this notion of building space. Everybody within any community needs to feel as if they have a space. That space sometimes we call this feeling of belonging. So creating that space for others, making sure that others feel and know that they have that space is so important. And not trying to completely replicate someone else's experience, but allow the space for that experience to exist and to hold weight. I think those are ways in which we can get to beloved communities, listening and creating space.
Thank you.
Dr. G, can I just add something?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to ask you a question next. Please go ahead.
Well, I'll lead into that. I mean, I think part of it too is an acceptance. Is an acceptance that we can't truly understand where somebody is coming from, right? We can listen, we can try to hear about their experiences, but also accepting that we will never truly live the life they've lived and understand that. And an acceptance of that, and awareness and acknowledgement of that, I think is really important.
How in those moments, Mr. Barnard, I think there's so much has been said today about listening, which I really appreciate. How in the moments of those sometimes difficult conversations, as Mr. Mckim said so well, we're not logical creatures a lot of the time. We feel, right? How do we counteract the static that we either hear around us or within our own head that sometimes prevents us from truly listening, right? We've spoken a lot about what it means to listen, the notion of having the courage to listen and to love in the face of hate, that deep breath, right? Really trying to endeavor to understand someone else's experiences, even as we accept that we can never fully understand someone else's experiences. How do we listen with complete openness? How do we cut through that static? Can you think of a time when you've had a conversation that's tough, right? Where our own voice in our head might hinder our ability from fully loving that other person in that moment. And love being defined by that willingness to listen with an open heart. Could you elaborate more about techniques and strategies that benefit you when it's a difficult conversation, but we're really trying to listen and what that means?
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes it's time. I think it's our human tendency to be defensive, and I think it takes time, it takes humility. I have a really close friend of mine from high school. I grew up white on a small farm in rural Pennsylvania, and this classmate of mine who I shared a dorm with was black from Brooklyn, New York, and we shared very different experiences. We are now both college counselors. We both share a lot of common experiences, but also have very different experiences. And we've kept in close touch these many years. And in the last couple years, when there's been a lot of increased awareness and racial tension, we've had some really difficult conversations about our profession, about our personal lives. And I think we both have been very defensive sometimes going into those conversations, but taking a moment to step back and acknowledge that defensiveness, and again, listen to each other and listen and be willing to engage in those conversations with openness and kind of checking ourselves constantly has been really important and really meaningful. And to realize that they're not easy conversations, and they're not meant to be, and accepting that, and be willing to embrace that and live in that discomfort.
Thank you very much.
Can I
Mr.
just
Mckim, please, go ahead.
add something to that? I do a workshop on how to have difficult conversations. So this is very top of mind for me. And St. Francis has a prayer. Does anybody know what the St. Francis' prayer is? Seek to understand before seeking to be understood. I think that approach to listening is what is successful. Seek to understand before seeking to be understood. That's the listening. It's the deep listening that allows you to understand that other person and understand how to communicate with that other person. And we can get into neuroscience and the four thinking styles, the Ned Herman whole brain thinking model and all of that. But it boils down to building a relationship with that person, which is not transactional. Which means, and there's a saying that we have in doing this work, expect and accept non-closure. You may not be able to come to agreement right now, but if you keep at it, keep trying to understand, you will.
I find it so painful that we're out of time, as I would like to continue this conversation for another hour. I just want to say a couple things. I'm sorry, I had two questions I wanted to ask Dean Stimpson and Mr. Bongiorno. I'd like to ask those questions, but so our students can think about them, and I'm sorry that we're just about out of time. I wanted to ask Mr. Bongiorno, how do we unite under a shared set of intentions, right? Living with intention. And I think Derryfield does that well aspirationally, to be kind. Like that, to me, has been a defining part of our community from the first day I stepped foot in the hallways here. Be a kind human being and always aspire to be that way. How do we purposely do that within smaller groups? So that's a question I wanted to ask Mr. Bongiorno that I ask you to think about. We as a community aspire to do that at Derryfield. How do we do that within smaller groups? And it has to be purposeful, right? The intentionality of it really matters to build these kinships, to build this beloved community. I wanted to ask Dean Stimpson about how do we gain self-awareness and insight into our own biases? How do we hold ourselves accountable? Because that's a good specific question to ask. We shouldn't just assume that that's natural. That's a skill that we need to work at. In closing, I just want to highlight that Dr. King spoke about the notion of a beloved community. It's not utopian. It's something that can be realized. But I hope you take away from what's been said today and some of the answers to these questions, that entails hard work. That entails, again, the word intentionality, really trying. Sometimes it's going to be messy. But the meaning of trying starts with the endeavor to understand those around us, to truly understand, to truly engage them with an open heart, and to truly listen. And the meaning of listening isn't as easy as it might sound at face value. It requires thought and requires a lot of preparation, engagement. Sometimes it's going to go well, sometimes it's not, but the constant effort, that is what defines the meaning ultimately of a beloved community. Something that, again, to come back to how I started this discussion, the salvation of our civilization depends on it. So thank you very much to Mr. Mckim. How wonderful to have you here today. And thank you to our faculty commentators.